Back in 2013, the Reverend Andy Stanley was invited to preach a sermon at one of the inaugural prayer services for the U.S. president. And Andy Stanley's sermon was all about power. And he asked this question: what do you do when it dawns on you that you are the most powerful person in the room? Now, of course, he was talking to the president, but he was also talking to everyone else. He says, we've all been that person at one time or another, though we may deny it. In relationships to our friends, coworkers, family, or in casual interactions with others, we might be the most powerful person in the room. Sarah Coakley, a Christian theologian, and she's an academic writer, and most of her books and articles have to do with power and how we wield it. And she says everybody has some amount of power, whether that be power over your children, power over your employees, your students, your athletes, your team, you name it. She says maybe it's power over your domestic animals, aka Fido. But we all have some amount of power. What do you do when you discover that you're the most powerful person in the room? And we all know what Jesus did in that upper room when he was the most powerful person in the room. Before he was about to be betrayed and arrested and crucified, he got on his hands and knees in the manner of a servant, and he washed Peter's feet. He washed the feet of the disciples. Where today's story picks up, Jesus again has already been raised from the dead. And he's appearing as the risen Lord to his disciples. Now, he's already in John's Gospel appeared to Thomas, and now he's primarily going to appear to Peter. Peter is the lead disciple, creme de la creme. He is the rock. You know, his name, Petra, means rock. And Jesus has called him the rock of the church. But like with any leader, he has a shadow side. He is not without flaw. You remember what he does the night before? That night when Jesus is going to be crucified? Before the cock crows, what does he do? 3 times he denies knowing Jesus. I don't know the man. I don't know the man. I don't know the man. Peter is not without flaw. It reminds me of a story by Father Ron Rolheiser. I've been reading a lot of him this year. And when Ron was a young priest, he was full of ambition and intensity, and he went on spiritual retreat. And this elderly nun took him aside, and she's like, I'm going to give you some good wisdom here, and I want you to heed it. Pay attention to it and do it. And her wisdom to this young, ambitious young priest was, be not afraid. You are inadequate. Do not be afraid. You are inadequate. And that's lesson number 1 for how to feed God's lambs, is we need to remember that we are not adequate because God and God alone is adequate. We are limited in how we can care for others. Parents, I hate to tell you this, perfection, and it takes one to know one, but perfection is not the goal. You are going to wound your children. You're not going to mean to do it, but there's no getting around it. You're going to wound your children, just like our parents have wounded us. They haven't meant to, but because their love is limited, it's not limitless like God's love, it ends up wounding us. They're not God. And so here's what we have to do. If we're going to keep our families intact, if we're going to keep our churches intact, if we're going to keep our communities strong, because we are limited, we're going to have to practice over and over and over a whole lot of forgiveness. You know, if people are married a long, long time, I know they're forgiving people. But over and over, we're going to have to forgive each other. You know what we have to forgive each other for? Not being God. So I want you to remember, fear not, you are inadequate. The second lesson for feeding lambs without it becoming life-draining, we want it to be life-giving, not life-draining. And the second lesson is this: trust God's plans and not your plans. You know the difference between God's plan and your plan, don't you? God's plan works, yours does not. Now, going back to Peter, he's got some plans. You remember, this is in the wake of the resurrection, which had been an earth-shattering event. It was chaotic. It was uncertain. They were trying to reorient their lives. And in that chaos, what does Peter do? He goes back to what he knows. He's a fisher person by trade. And so he announces to everyone, I am going fishing. And the disciples around him say, we will go with you. And they fish all night long. And guess how many fish they catch? 0. No fish. And then morning comes. The light shines in the darkness. And Jesus is close by. Only they don't recognize Jesus. And then Jesus calls out. He uses this word, children. Have you caught anything? Have you caught any fish that will sustain you and keep you from burning out? He didn't say it that way, but I will. And they have to say to him, no, we haven't caught anything. And so Jesus has a plan. Try this, he says. Why don't you cast your nets on the right side of the boat? And they do it. They listen to Jesus and they follow his plan. And guess what happens? They catch so many fish that they can't even bring them into the boat. Their nets are ripping apart. There's so many fish. They catch over 150 fish, 153 to be exact. And I don't know why 153, but that's not really the point. The point is that when we trust God's plan instead of our own plan, we're provided for way beyond anything that we could ever measure or imagine. So lesson number 2 for feeding lambs without burning out is to trust God's plans, not our plans. Back to Peter. He's in the boat. And you know what he's wearing? Nothing. He's naked. I've been thinking about that all week. What in the world is that supposed to mean? Not Peter, but you know what I mean. The whole idea. Gosh. Oh, believe. Okay. So why is Peter naked? It dawned on me to go back to the book of Genesis in the beginning where we find Adam and Eve, and after they eat of the tree, the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they notice that they are naked. And that means simply they're limited. They're finite. And it also means throughout Scripture when you see the word naked, it means vulnerability. And I wonder if Peter is vulnerable in this moment because often we're not receptive. We can't even recognize the risen Lord unless we are powerless, unless we are vulnerable. It takes being at that rock bottom place for some of us to recognize the truth. But Peter finally does recognize Jesus, and he throws on some clothes, and they're in a boat right now, about 100 yards away from the shore where Jesus is. And so Peter jumps out of the boat, and he scrambles to get to Jesus. He wants to see Jesus face to face, and Jesus does what a good parent does. Jesus says to the disciples, "Come and have breakfast." And Jesus feeds his disciples. And then Jesus has this come to Jesus talk with Peter, but not the kind of talk that you and I might be thinking. Jesus asked Peter 3 times, and biblical scholars think it's a threefold formula to undo the formula from the betrayal, where Peter denies Jesus 3 times. Now Jesus will ask Peter 3 times, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Now note what Jesus doesn't do. Note this, parents. Jesus doesn't say, Peter, get over here so I can let you have it for deserting me. Jesus doesn't ask him to apologize. Jesus doesn't even ask him to offer an explanation. All Jesus does is ask, do you love me? What a daunting question. Have you ever had someone look you in the eye and ask you, do you love me? Do you really love me? Do you love me? Jesus, the risen Lord, is being extraordinarily vulnerable. This is mutuality. Mutuality of love, of trust, and of great power. You got to remember, the world did not accept Jesus. You know, they rejected him. And they put him away and killed him on a cross like any other bandit or pariah. And of his radical message, those people who were in control and had power and were successful, you know what they did with his radical message? They rejected it. They dismissed it. But there were a few. There were a few women. There were a few men. And Jesus called them friends. And they were able to recognize him. Because they had eyes to see, they had ears to hear, and they had open hearts to understand. And that leads me to the final lesson on how not to burn out when feeding lambs, when nurturing and caring for others. And it comes straight from Henry, the great late Henry Nouwen. And he recommends that we move from the moral to the mystical. I want you to say that with me. Move from the moral to the mystical. Moral issues are important. Parents, we need for you to teach your children morals. And what do we mean by morals? And we need to have morals in the church because morals are about good and evil, right and wrong. And those are important. But what Henry Nouwen says is, as important as morals are, our morality needs to flow from our mysticism. Now you're thinking, what in the world is she talking about? Well, stay tuned because part 2 is next week and I'm going to go deeper into the mystical life. So come back. But Nouwen is saying that our moralism needs to flow out of the mystical life. And what I mean by that is a deep, intimate, and ever-abiding communion with God and with others. You see, we get so caught up in the issues, you know, politically, in our families. We are so focused on the issues, and the issues, they just rip us apart. They divide us. You know, if I were to ask you, how's it going in your family? How's it going with your daughter? You might ask me, how's it going in your church or your denomination? We might ask the president, how's it going in the country and in the world? And an answer that we all might give is, well, it's going fine because we're Americans and we like to save face. But we would say, you know, it's going fine, but I do have some, issues. Jean Vanier, a mentor of Henry Nouwen, and he said it this way: we can only deal well with issues out of an infinite, and I would add intimate, relationship with God and others. I'm going to close with a story. And it just so happens to be a story about a mother and her son. And it's from this book, Radical Acceptance, by Dr. Tara Brach. Now, Tara Brach, she's out of the Buddhist tradition, and she teaches meditation. She's highly regarded. I mean, millions of people download her podcasts and her teaching. She is a spiritually evolved person, is the point I'm trying to make here, okay? But even she Fear not, we are inadequate. Even she, as evolved as she is, struggles. And in her book, she tells a story about her son who was in the 8th grade. And he was beginning to be rebellious, you know. His grades were slipping. And he was not getting all of his homework done. And he started playing an inordinate amount of video games. Anybody here like video games? I know a few who do. And to her, he was wasting his time. And she would get so frustrated to the point of anger. And so she would scold him, she would correct him, and the more she corrected him, the more he rebelled. And this went back and forth. I mean, they were in this painful standoff. And then one evening, she could hear the video games going, and she knew that his homework wasn't completed, and she just got so frustrated and so angry that she barged through in his bedroom, and she just let him have it, a verbal lashing about how he's wasting his life. And this went on, you know the drill, I'm sure. Back and forth, back and forth. And she realized what they were doing was not working, okay? So one night she was in bed and in a more peaceful, meditative, kind of prayerful posture, and she realized how fast time was going by. Her son was already in the 8th grade. Pretty soon he was going to be out of the house, living his own life. And she resolved herself in that moment to be more open-hearted. Why don't you say those words with me? Open-hearted. You know, your heart almost has to expand to say that word. Open-hearted. Say it again. Open-hearted. She resolved to be more open-hearted, respectful, and loving when in his presence. Next morning, got up, started her day, came home. The evening was going on, and guess what the son in the 8th grade was doing? Closed door, playing video games, and she was triggered. So triggered that she got so angry that she barged for his bedroom door, but only this time she caught herself. And she paused. And she waited for her heartbeat to calm down. She relaxed her shoulders. She unclenched her jaw, that grip, you know. And she said to herself, why am I so angry? She knew exactly why. She said, I'm afraid. I'm afraid that my child is going to grow up and he'll fail in life, and he won't live a fulfilled life, and he'll be unhappy. And then she thought to herself, I'm afraid it's going to be all my fault. I'm afraid that I'm going to fail as a parent. And with a softer heart, she opened the door gently, and she said to her son, hey, can we talk? And they did, and she talked some, but she also listened some. And she was respectful. And she was kind. And nothing, she says, was different. You know, her son was still not doing his homework, and he was still playing all those video games, and she still had her same rules. But what she says was different was how she was feeling within. I was open-hearted. I was loving. And the tone of the exchange was warm. Again, the words of Jean Vanier, we can only deal well with issues out of an infinite, and I would add intimate, relationship with God and with others. Burnout is real, but it is not God's will for us. God's will for us is this mystical, this deep and intimate, infinite, ever-abiding communion with God and others, so that when Jesus, the risen Christ, the most powerful force in this planet, asks of you and of me, do you love me? Do you love me? do you love me? We'll know somewhere deep, deep down precisely what to say and do. Happy Mother's Day, everyone. So be it, and so it is. Amen.